The little screw thing.
You can keep that share beside that.
No, I use this for my timer. Ladies and gentlemen, the length of the organ donors waiting list is something that causes such preventable yet massive social harms in society today. The simple act of more people signing up to donate their organs when they are dead, which does no harm to them while they are living, is an opportunity for people to massively help out people that they've never met, that they have no natural inclination to help out, but that they have no reason to be harming. So what we're proposing today is a solution to that preventable problem. So what are we proposing? We're proposing that organs should become the property of the state when someone dies if they sign up for that, like literally all of the organs in your body, and that donating non-essential organs while you are alive is okay, but independent of this debate. So the kind of organ donation we're talking about is the donation of all of your body's organs, including the essential ones, at the point of your death. We do not think that this is a case of coercing or compelling people, and we expect people to be signing up onto this program, as I will explain shortly. I'm going to argue, first of all, why people refuse to I'm going to describe, first of all, why we think people refuse to donate organs in the first place, and I'm going to describe how we think our policy applies to these people and effectively gets them to sign up for the program, while at the same time talking about why it is so necessary in the first place. But before I do that, no, okay, not gonna. Okay, so why do people refuse to donate their organs in the first place? We can think of three possible reasons for that. First of all, and we think this one is massively important, and the greater majority of the cases that we're talking about, indifference. People do not think that they're going to be potential organ donors in any time in the near future. It's not something that they bother to do, even if they're not averse to the idea of doing so. This is not something that people think about. And we believe, and we would suggest, that this is a case of hyperbolic discounting. You don't expect to be a potential donor because you do not imagine your own untimely death. But before I move on, Jason.
Sir, if this is so important for your side, why is the state not willing to require individuals to give up their organs after death, even without the sign-up for 2 years?
Because we still respect consent, Mr. Speaker. That is something we're going to respect and defend on government side if we have to. The fact that people have the right to their own body and to decide what happens to that body, because this is something that matters to them. Even what happens to your body when you are dead, Madam Speaker, when you are no longer conscious to be affected by that, is something you will expect while you are living. Right? There's the saying that the rights of the dead aren't really for the dead because they're dead and they can't really experience things anymore. But while you are living as a being that will inevitably experience death, it matters to you how your body will be treated, and that is a massive effect on your own happiness. This is why, for example, for religious reasons, which is the next reason we think people refuse to donate their organs, well, we're going to be okay with them not donating it either. Except we also believe, sit down, in these cases, these people are often also prohibited from receiving these organs in the first place anyway, right? So we think that as much as people have the right to be, we think that as much as people have the right to keep their bodies, the right to do what they want with their bodies, it has to also come with some consequences, as all rights that you practice and own do, right? So if it is simply a case that you are just ignorant, are potentially willing but not thinking about it, then we want to get to you. We want to make you think about this potential problem, such that at the point where you are an actual potential organ donor, you are saving someone else's life. let's move on to the next point of analysis. What does this policy solve, and why is it such an important problem to solve in the first place? The problem is that there aren't enough organs in circulation. The organ waiting list takes months, if not years, to get to the end of, and many people simply die. This is a massive sit-down and preventable social harm. Moreover, we also think that if you are lacking in organs and you still manage to survive that situation, the time between which you need those organs and at the point where you get those organs after you get to the end of the waiting list, it creates expensive complications along the way. So even if you survive, you get screwed over by the situation anyway. Now, what they're going to probably fight us on, given what they've been POIing, is effectiveness. Why do we believe our policy is sufficiently effective to get this problem out of the way? We think it successfully pierces the problem of hyperbolic discounting. Let me explain the incentive structure that most people work with, right? First of all, most people have an inclination to avoid risk, but at the same time, they have an aversion to even just the idea of death. So this is the situation and the perception you'll be working with as an average reasonable person under our policy. There is a low risk of death, and that you're not potentially going to be giving up your organs, even if that's something you're uncomfortable with to some extent, but willing to ultimately do. But at the same time, there is the high reward of being saved just in case, right? Even if the risk itself is a low-risk thing that's unlikely to happen to you, but the reward that comes at that situation that protects you, the way people perceive things is such that you will always be worried about those little risks, right? This is why people are afraid of flying in airplanes, despite the fact that they're safer than cars, because when an airplane crashes, that makes the news and it's sensationalized for a long while. Sit down. We believe that people will effectively realize at this point under our policy that when, like, the mere small possibility that you will need an organ, that you will need to be on the organ donation list, will mean that you will be more than willing to sign on to that program, right? The small subset of religious Jehovah's Witnesses type people who aren't willing to donate their organs and who wouldn't be allowed to take these organs from other people anyway because it violates the exact same principle will not be affected by our policy because no matter how effective the organ donor waiting list is, these people simply won't take an organ. Who we are targeting are the vast majority of people who would be willing but just simply aren't thinking about it, just simply haven't given it enough thought to overcome whatever level of initial discomfort there may be and decided eventually to move on, who would decide eventually to make themselves that much more useful to society. We are more than glad to propose.
Thank the Prime Minister for his speech. I would now like to invite the next opposition.
It's disgusting to trade human life for speculative benefits that can be achieved without even applying the policy of government bench. That's why we, in opposition, we will adamantly defend that the right to receive organs should be accessible to everyone, regardless of their contribution to the current organ pool, ladies and gentlemen, and members of this House. And we will defend this in the idea in analyzing, firstly, why we think that there exists a right to unrestricted access that is pegged to the primacy of life, which is the ultimate goal of having a state to begin with, a state that you can rely on, that is available, that can aid you in times of need. But secondly, we think that under their model, they also want to respect the consent of individuals. That's why they're not forcing them to begin with, right? We think under their model, you even disrespect that consent, given the fact that you vitiate that consent, that their life is pegged on whether or not, if you do not donate your organ, then there is no way for you to get an organ and you will eventually die. That is what you call vitiation of consent. But before I proceed to my case, allow me first to respond to some things coming from Prime Minister. His only argument coming from this side of the House is this, that people do not simply care, they don't want to give their organs because they are indifferent. Well, we ask the question, what is so compelling about that? Because if the problem is indifference, it can be subsumed by our policy intensifying campaign, ladies and gentlemen, campaign awareness for organ donation, ladies and gentlemen. Because the problem why people do not simply care is because they aren't aware about the human face of the problem, right? That there is already a lack of organs that are currently in the market. That's why if we are able to increase blood donations, ladies and gentlemen, even donations for the high-end victims, because we put a human face to the problem, that is also the same thing that we can apply under their model. Create a human face that people are dying on the ground and that you need to donate your organ because that is a problem that you must respond to. So all of their benefits can be achieved without restricting that access to individuals who truly need them. Before I proceed, yeah.
So information campaigns such as blood drives, for example, and all of these kinds of things that ask people to give up parts of their bodies at no real cost to themselves haven't been effective in real society because the reach just isn't there.
Shame. I've already proven it worked, ladies and gentlemen. It's just that we're not creating much effort in intensifying our campaign to entice people to sign up for organ donations, which will not have any cost to them because according to you, it will be given after they die. Now, the first idea that I want to discuss is this. Why do we think that we must respect the right of individuals to unrestricted access to the organ pool? Because the ultimate goal of this debate, which they also conceded, is the primacy of life, right? Because all other rights are actually pegged on your life, your mobility, economic rights, ladies and gentlemen. But more importantly, if the life of that individual is what enables him to contribute to society, ladies and gentlemen, right? That's why we invest a lot in healthcare because of the human capital that we currently have, right? If we do not have individuals within society that aren't healthy, then we will have an immobile society. No one paying their taxes, no one fulfilling their civil obligation. What is the point? These individuals that you are denying this particular right has also contributed to society in other means, right? But probably the man that you are denying an organ is a man who has paid his taxes very well, an individual who has been a good civilian and was able to contribute to society because of his taxes and other good actions that he has made. What is the point? Although he wasn't able to contribute in that sense, he wasn't able to donate his organ, but because he was able still to donate in other means. What is the point? We think it is disgusting for you to deny that right, given the fact that this individual might have been the one who had helped, for example, the donor of that organ to be well and alive because of the taxes that he was paying. What is the point of this idea? We think that you are only judging the contribution of an individual to society based on his decision to donate his organ. And that is one-dimensional only because of the other aspects that an individual could have already contributed to society. For example, the soldier, ladies and gentlemen, although he did not want to donate his organ, but because he contributed well to the safety of society, for example, we think that it is disgusting for us to deny his right to life just because he did not agree to donate his organ. Now, you think under their model, you even endanger a lot of lives because of this, right? Because it's also disgusting for them to say that some individuals do not donate their organ for the main reason that they're indifferent. That's not the point. Because other individuals do not want to donate their organ based on long and enduring religious convictions, right? That's why in Islam, ladies and gentlemen, you do not have embalming. Because according to the Islamic religion, that we must preserve the entire body of a dead individual. That's why we do not get their blood, for example, and we do not get their organ. So under their model, you deny Muslims, ladies and gentlemen, to be able to receive these particular organs just because they have the long and enduring conviction to not be able to give their organs to begin with. Now, let's assume that a Muslim, for example, would decide to donate his organ, despite that he will actually disobey the will of Allah in this matter. We think that you vitiate, therefore, the consent of that individual, because to them, they do not want to force individuals to donate their organs because we want to respect their bodily autonomy, we want to respect their dignity. That's why we're not forcing them. Under their model, you vitiate that particular consent, mainly because you pegged it simply to their life, what is the point? It becomes black and white. It's either you choose to live by your convictions or die because of that decision to begin with. We think that the consent, as we talked about, is when an individual realizes first the benefit or the good out of the decision that he will be making, ladies and gentlemen, because he will actually go against his very principles in life if he decides to actually consent to give up his right over his body, even beyond his grave. That's why you have first to make that individual well informed about the good that he will get out of donating his organs, probably saving another human life, and all of that stuff. So in summation, what do we defend in opposition bench? It's simple. It's disgusting for you to say that individual should be denied that right to access to organs just because he did not contribute in the way you wanted them to contribute. Because he could have had contributed a lot in other aspects in life. But more importantly, you do not force them to donate their organs because you respect their consent. And you vitiate that consent if you push them to the wall and say that it's either you die or you give up your organs. For all of these reasons, the motion should definitely not pass.
I thank the leader of opposition and would now like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister for the case submission.
We're going to forward two things. First, does this truly vitiate consent, as the previous speaker alleges? And second, is this an absolute right in the sense that the state should provide it regardless of any reciprocal obligation? The rebuttals will be mostly integrated, but let's deal with some stuff that don't quite fit in. First, we think that the problem diagnosis coming from the previous speaker was a farce. He said that the only reason there's a shortage of organs is that we aren't trying hard enough to advertise the need. We think, ladies and gentlemen, so many people are already dying from the fact that there are really, really long organ donation lists. There are so many people who aren't getting these organs. We've already probably humanized it as much as we can. When you put the faces of those poor children who need new kidneys, who need new hearts, we've already humanized it as much as we can. What they're failing to engage with is, given that we've already humanized it as much as we can, what do we do now, given that the problem is still there? We think that that's the problem that they're not really addressing. But secondly, even if we throw them a bone and assume that intensifying awareness is really the problem, we don't really understand why our policy is mutually exclusive from that policy of intensifying campaigns. We can also intensify awareness, and if it works, good for us. We think, ladies and gentlemen, there's really nothing lost. But thirdly, we would also like to make the same accusation that they pointed to us, because isn't it that you're also sort of vitiating consent by manipulating these individuals with like heartfelt images and the humanizing all of these stories? We think, ladies and gentlemen, it's not necessarily true that you're always vitiating consent, and we think that their alternative proves that they are indeed willing to vitiate consent to some degree if they do accept that there will be some consent that will be vitiated. This leads me on to the first question. Does this really vitiate consent, and is this coercive? We think that generally courts decide what constitutes coercion based on numerous factors surrounding the case, but generally it can be decided on two very simple questions. First, was it an unfair or fair trade-off to expect that individual to make? And secondly, was it a mutually beneficial outcome that could have been reached when you made that decision? We think that in this policy, it is clearly a fair trade-off that is mutually beneficial, because if you as an individual promise to donate your organs at some point in the future, you will also be given organs in the event that you need it. So basically, under our model, it's something that's very transactional, something that's quid pro quo. If you give something, you will receive something. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, this is very similar to how a lot of transactions in the status quo work, but we don't necessarily brand these things as stuff that vitiate consent. But what we did hear coming from the previous speaker was that it vitiates consent because your life becomes pegged on donating an organ.
We think that this is false because your life is pegged on obtaining many, many things aside from just organs, but we don't call these things in obtaining them as vitiating consent. For instance, your life is pegged on finding gainful employment. If you do not find gainful employment, you have no food on the table, you have no shelter, you have no clothes on your back. Your life is pegged on the fact that you need to gain gainful employment, but we do not say that the process of finding gainful employment will vitiate consent to any degree. So we don't really understand where the vitiation of consent is coming from, particularly because it is a mutually beneficial decision. But let's deal with the second thing. I want to talk about what constitutes a right and why we think that there's going to be reciprocity in terms of receiving and donating organs. We think that receiving an organ is not a right upheld in an absolute manner, as a previous speaker would like to insinuate. Because what they're doing is that they're conflating the right to life with the right to receive an organ. But we think that the right to life consists of many, many different things, and we think that not all of these things are treated by the state as default. But first, let me argue why receiving an organ is not a right upheld in an absolute manner, as a previous speaker would like to suggest. Okay, we think the right is something that must be provided to you without prejudice. So for instance, the right to life and the freedom of mobility are assumed to be given as a default state by virtue of you being human, and it's taken away only if you've done something wrong. No, thank you. But given this definition of a right, we see that states right now do not provide organs as a default state. For instance, if you're a state, you can take away organs from inmates on death row, for instance, and give it to the people on the organ donation list, but you don't necessarily do that because the state doesn't treat this particular receiving of an organ as a default right. So if it doesn't treat it as a default right, we think that rather than a default right, the state treats the right to receive an organ as a secondary right or as an alienable right. And we think that there's something that falls along the lines of the right to get a job or stuff like that. So why exactly is the right to get a job an interesting parallel? Because while you have the right to get a job, and while the state recognizes it as something that's inherent to how you live, to how you operate, to how you construct your choices, you also need to provide something in order to accrue that right. In order to enjoy the right to get a life, you actually need to be productive, you need to actually hone your skills and provide value to your employer. So we think that it's alienable in the sense that if you're unable to provide something reciprocal, the state can take it away and the state is under no obligation to provide it. So we think that rights are not always absolute, and rights here are reciprocal. Okay. And we can take a look at further examples, no thank you, like the right to infrastructure or the right to healthcare. I'm going to engage with the previous speaker about this, but before that, sure.
If a person, for example, is already dying in an emergency situation and didn't sign up, are you going to allow that person to have an organ transplant?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. We prepared for that. Yes, we will allow that person to have an organ transplant. And I know the next thing you're going to say is that, oh, it's coercive because you're putting him in a difficult place. But we think, ladies and gentlemen, again, that's where you go back to the first argument. I've already preempted this, about how the coercion element is not necessarily there because it's a mutually beneficial transaction anyway, and we think that there was free choice for that individual. And secondly, assuming that our policy wasn't in place, then that individual would have died anyway. So the status quo right now in itself is the status quo that is coercive, because right now there is no recourse, there is no choice but to die because you're so down low on the waiting list. So let me continue. Why do we believe that rights are not? Why do we believe that rights have reciprocal relationships? The argument coming from the previous speaker was that, oh, they're contributing to society, they pay taxes. Why don't we believe that this is good enough? You pay taxes because tax money can build roads, can build schools, can build hospitals. Tax money can't build new organs. And that's why, ladies and gentlemen, if you operate using the logic that they contribute to society in the form of their taxes, that's why it's manifesting in so many benefits. Why is it different in this case, particularly when what you're contributing is not necessarily equivalent to what you are receiving, or cannot really create what you want to receive anyway? And that's why there's something unique about receiving an organ if and only if you actually are in the position to donate it in the very first place. Because we believe that we have a very principled basis on how we allocate rights, and because we believe that we're addressing the urgency of the situation, and they are not. We are taking this debate.
Thank you, Mr. And now I can invite the Deputy People's Opposition to continue with his opposition.
Sure.
I'm going to answer two questions today. The first is, how do we change people's mindset about organ donation, which is the problem they set up in the debate? And second, let's take a look at the position of the state in assessing rights. Do we really have an obligation to give up our organs in order for the state to give us other people's as well? So let's go on to the first question. Because we agree that the problem about the waiting list and that there are potential rewards that will happen with the increasing number of organs being harvested. What we don't agree with, coming from opposition, is the characterization of people from affirmative bench, that they chose not to sign up because they absolutely do not care about their fellow human beings. They can't say that this debate only applies to those people who are indifferent, not about religious convictions, not about individuals who chose freely not to give their organs as well, because these are the people that you want to save to at the end of the day. There are two potential scenarios in affirmative bench. If you use their characterization, then you will have people who will say, I don't care about you, but I need the organ at one point in time. Our defense coming from opposition bench is that I probably have had contributed in other ways, such as me being a good citizen, me contributing much to the economy, me forwarding education, being a part of charitable institutions that provide a sustainable and a consumable public good that the state wants you to forward as well. What they haven't understood and they haven't responded to at this point in time is that why is that a parallel good for the state to give you the ability to live longer, considering that they also said that the right to life is pegged on the ability of an individual to have functioning organs to begin with, ladies and gentlemen. So what we defended coming from government opposition is that this is also a compensation to whatever they've already contributed to society. But there's also another characterization coming from opposition bench. We disagree that we've done everything in order for people to sign up. In fact, if you look at economic journals, the reason why there's a lack of organ donation is because there's a lack of awareness. Not that they're selfish, but they might have had different ideologies about that already, Mr. Speaker, Madam Speaker, and members of this House. If they tell us that we've done everything to put a human face, I don't think that the organ donation campaigns are as intensive as AIDS campaigns, for example, or blood drives, or you telling people that they should give up. And there's high threshold for you campaigning for organ donation because the state recognizes that it can never be its property. It's something that is functional to an individual. It's something that the individual can cling to, ladies and gentlemen. So they tell us, but you're also vitiating consent on your side because you're putting externalities as well. We think that the battle for consent is that that individual must be able to give that organ up despite the externalities because you chose to undergo that. Parallel to the idea that even if I did not want to donate, the obligation of the state to save my life still exists, and they never defended that. So we say, yes, it's a fair trade-off considering my contribution to society, and even if there's no contribution, the existence of a right that I give to the state to protect myself is already there. But then they tell us, it's not about the religious individuals. They're not our target market because they're not going to ask for an organ anyway, and that they're going to be the people that the policy will not affect. We don't think so, because at the point of near death, this is where the people can change their mindset and break those norms at the point of need and at the point of epiphany. You now have two choices. To have a state that has a face saying, you did contribute before, you probably will never contribute in the future. We don't care about you. That's why we won't save you. As compared to a state that says, we might disagree with organ donation, we might disagree with our ability to appreciate other human lives, but at this point that you need it, the state will give it to you. I think that's a more symbolic, that's a stronger rhetoric to change mindsets, especially if people already at the point of near death, ladies and gentlemen, and members of this House. But then they tell us it's parallelized to the right to get a job. And that's very disgusting because we don't think, ladies and gentlemen, that the right to get a job is as important or as crucial as your right to life, for example, because they tell us they have to provide something, like productivity. They have to prove yourself. That right is commutable, but the right to life is not commutable because the right to life is what gives you the ability to exercise other economic rights that the states would want to have. So at this point in time, we think that the state even becomes a dehumanized face of what it wants society to be. And you have to link it back to the concept of donation. There's a reason why you call people donors, because they give out of their gratuitous conscience and not because you're forcing them to. What they make is that to make that particular act, ladies and gentlemen, synonymous to an obligation that people will suffer if they did not do that. We don't think that's even the language you want to get if people are supposed to change their mindsets. Yes, Alan?
Sir, you're conflating the right to life with the right to receive an organ. Because again, the right to receive an organ is not absolute, because if it were, the states would be exhausting any measure in order to provide you that life, but they don't.
We don't think that the right to life is absolute in the strictest sense. What we're saying is that the right to life is not pegged to your obligation to give an organ. We said that the right to life must be weighed against the state's ability to provide for you as well. What does their proposal do? Two things. Two perverse incentives. They tell us, ladies and gentlemen, if people sign up under their proposal, then what you send as a message to people is that you can live an unhealthy life anyway, because the state will be able to save you at the end of the day. That donor sign up is what makes them safe in their feelings. In fact, what we say is that your inability to sign up for organ donors is even the disincentive for that individual to not take care of the body, because he knows that he did not contribute as well. But second of all, if they did not sign up, Alan already conceded in their policy that at the point of death, they're willing to give organs. So that even is a weak policy, because you're not making people sign up when their consent is actually free. But let's go on to the second idea. What is the position of the state in assessing rights? And this is where we want to discuss the concept of negative rights. The right to give does not exist, because that imposes an obligation of the state to give up something that is crucial as a part of your life. The question that Ina has to answer is that why can we trade human life for assumed benefit, or why can you forward a moral ideology vis-a-vis a clear and present danger to health of an individual? We think that, like, for example, you have a negative right against torture. The state allows you to exist and to work as an individual, but it cannot do something against you because that is against your human dignity. That is the parallel to the right to receive and to give an organ. So on those two levels, I don't think their policy even recognizes what Nick said to be the goal of the debate. But second of all, you don't change mindsets, and it's not parallel to any other right that they forwarded. Thank you.
Now let's invite the government to
The problem with negative bench in this debate is they conflate the idea of the right to life with attaining an organ. We concede right off the bat that getting an organ can increase your quality of life in the same way jobs do, in the same way you having food, in the same way you having a salary, in the same way with you having home. Your quality of life is different from your right to exist or your right to be treated as a human being in the state, and that's the reason why they cannot take this debate, because they're conflating two issues which are not the same. They've only told us, well, you contributed in other ways, therefore you have the right to receive organs anyway. But we told you, coming from Alan, that your contribution cannot ever create an organ. As opposed to if you pay taxes, your taxes can create roads. Your taxes can create schools and hospitals. So even in the best case scenario where everyone has the right to access an organ, they never told us why these organs will exist in the first place. Two questions which I want to answer. First, I want to talk about where is access for organs developed. No, thank you. Because coming from the Prime Minister, he told us that individuals should have unlimited access to organs because it is a right of everyone. Jason decided to reiterate this. The problem with that is twofold. First problem is they never told us what will they access, given that we told you that the waiting list is so long, and they conceded that it's so long, and there are barely any organs in the waiting list. So even if the best case scenario where these rights exist in absolutes, they never prove to us that there is something to access. Their only solution is the idea of campaigns. No, thank you. We told you that these campaigns already exist in the status quo. We told you that they said that people aren't informed. We think that's an absolute lie. You being able to give your organs comes up in commercials. You being able to ask whether or not you want to donate actually comes out in licenses. before you apply. You being able to donate, they actually ask you in the job when you are signing job contracts, right? So we think that is very implausible, especially in the age of information where there is internet, where there is Twitter, where there is Google, that you do not know that there is a scarcity of organs. We don't think we're living in caves anymore, right? So first, if that is their solution, we don't think it is mutually exclusive. But second, we also told you that it isn't sufficient. So at best, and this is us being generous to their side, what they have is a tokenistic absolute right to access organs without those organs existing in the first place. No, thank you. But they never responded to the idea when we told you that access to organs is not absolute anyway. The reason why organs is a secondary right is because it increases your quality of life. In the same way, if you have another kidney as opposed to just having like a dysfunctional kidney, no thank you, your access, your quality of life is much better off. Maybe you can run for longer periods of time. Maybe you can like go out to the malls if that's what you want to do, right? But the fact of the matter is we allow you to live whether or not you replace that kidney in the first place. The difference between you getting an organ and you being alive is you can opt out of getting that organ in the first place. For example, you can opt for dialysis as opposed to kidney transplants, right? So there are other mechanisms in place, no thank you, for you to be able to opt out. And that's why the default duty of the state is not to give everyone organs, but to give them a choice because it's a secondary right they can opt out of. That's what Alan said they never bothered to respond to. But even more than that, what shows you that it's not an absolute right is the fact that a lot of people in the status quo can be denied. The fact that even under their model, they have to prioritize certain people in a way. Maybe it's a first-come, first-served basis. Maybe they're not going to allow alcoholics or drug addicts to be able to attain those organs. Just shows you that you can be denied of an organ, and therefore, it's not the absolute right that they want to say it. No thinking. What we told you that secondary rights, which we've proven, actually entails reciprocal obligations. In the same way, if you want to have food on your table, which is a right, if you want to have a job, in order for you to have a better quality of life, to move up the economic ladder, if you want to have infrastructure, you also need to contribute back to society in terms of you being able to pay for taxes. But the unique and distinct adjective for what organs are is that your taxes cannot reproduce them. There's no other method in order for people to be able to attain more organs as opposed to a human being donating it. And that's why we think all your contributions in the past is irrelevant because it does not come to you being able to give that organ anyway. So we think access is much better on our model. Go on.
If you deny a person who needs a heart, then obviously that person will die. In extension, you deny him life. If you respect life, why are you not giving that organ, which is essential for him to exist?
But the same is true for you guys, especially when there aren't an abundance of hearts, right? It's much worse under your model because the consent of the people does not exist. They don't have a choice whether or not they can get a right because there is a heart, because there is no heart in the first place that exists. As opposed to under our model, if you're really concerned about choice, if you're really concerned about consent, the first step is to giving them choices whether or not they want the heart in the first place as opposed to having none. Why is access better in our model? Coming from Nick, we analyzed why people don't want to donate organs. And we have 5 reasons for this. First was the only one they engaged with. Maybe people have religious reasons like Islam, Scientology, and Jehovah's Witnesses. First, when you take a look at all the religions they decided to present on the table, those religions that don't allow you to give your organs also don't allow you to take organs anyway. They don't even allow blood transfusions. They don't allow you to get kidneys. They don't allow you to get hearts. Because the reason why these religions don't want you to donate organs is because they think that your body should stay the way it is. So we think the religions that they decided to present were irrelevant. But secondly, we think that if you want to talk about religious convictions, then it's up to an individual to be able to decide whether or not they want to prioritize the religious convictions as opposed to saving the right of someone else. And we're perfectly fine with that because your right to religion is not absolute anyway. For example, if you are an individual who thinks that it's perfectly fine for you to continue your practice of like abusing people in your religion because you think your God says so, we stop that in the status quo anyway because we realize that your life and the life of others are more important. So we're willing to compromise that under our model as well. Religion is not an absolute right. In fact, we think that it has been an excuse for a lot of people to commit abuses in the first place. What they never engaged us in is the idea of how about people who are just indifferent, the idea of people hyperbolic discounting, or the people who have irrational attachments to organs, right? We told you that our policy actually changes the calculus They never gave any response. We think it's a shame if it only comes from opposition whip. Lastly, this idea. Is it fair for the state to demand? Because they told us that consent is manipulated because your life depends on it. We don't understand then why that makes this choice any less of a choice. Because you're allowed to sign do not resuscitate contracts. You're allowed to say whether or not you want to check in the hospital, get chemotherapy or not. You being able to weigh your life, knowing that you take the consequences whether or not you die or whether or not you live, is a perfectly rational choice. Our choices do not exist in a vacuum. We think we're perfectly fine with emotions existing as well in your choice. We think this motion ought to stand.
I'd like to thank the government whip and would now like to invite the opposition.
Madam Chair, the two important issues in today's debate. Firstly is how do you solve the problem of shortage of organs? Is it through their policy of putting generally threatening individuals to donate? Or is it in policy where just you have an intensified awareness campaign which is not existent in status quo, ladies and gentlemen? And the second one is where do we protect rights of these individuals? On the first one, on the level of how do we solve the problem? Because affirmative bench came up with a policy of incentivizing people by threatening them if they do not receive, of not receiving organs, if they do not donate. They said that it's effective largely because of hyperbolic discounting. Never mind the fact that it was really poorly analyzed, but I can analyze it for them. Hyperbolic discounting actually is where people prioritize short-term benefits, right, more than long-term benefits because they do not see what's going to happen in the future. We say that it has no impact on individuals because that which will happen in the future is and the minds of these individuals will still happen far into the future. It's something which they wouldn't take into account at that particular moment, so it wouldn't compel them to sign up for your particular organs. But in a BOI, ladies and gentlemen, it's 200 billion because it came from me. So I asked them, if in an emergency situation and you did not sign up, will you allow them? And the response coming from the second speaker, which is Alan, is that yes. In that case, if you were going to allow them, then we think that your policy is a soft case. Yeah. Because if people would know, people who are so indifferent and people that who would know that they will receive it anyway in the future if the emergency arises, then they will not sign up and they will only, because there's a very big probability that they wouldn't receive it anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that they wouldn't be placed in those particular situations. But secondly, Mrs. Madam Chair, look at the harm on the individual. The coercion, for example. It's true that everybody will not be coerced, but for some people, like Muslims, for example, or Jehovah's Witnesses, who believe in the importance of keeping their body integrity intact, ladies and gentlemen, these are the people who will be affected, ladies and gentlemen. And we've also told you, and something which my second speaker has argued, that for these people, at the point of near death, their calculus changes. Sometimes you're willing to let go of their body because you're willing to protect their lives. These are the people who will be harmed. But lastly, what about the harm in emergency situations for people who are already placed in coma, for example, where they cannot sign up anymore for your body transplant? That doesn't mean that they wouldn't receive your the organs anymore. We think that these harms, which are quite clear to the individual, is something which would outweigh their particular benefit in today's debate. And the only benefit that they said is that there wouldn't be any dearth of or shortage of organs. No, because the way in which to go about it is to simply intensify awareness campaigns, ladies and gentlemen. If the problem is indifference and the lack of awareness, these are problems which are true in multiple causes as well, just like AIDS in Africa, as well as breast cancer, ladies and gentlemen. And the way in which states respond to it is not to enforce individuals to donate, but for states to prop up awareness in this. We're probably putting Bona and Bono and the AIDS commercial, for example, or probably putting it in a commercial of Louis Vuitton and all those things. We're probably having a breast awareness month, ladies and gentlemen. You don't threaten people to donate to Hurricane Katrina victims in order for you to be able to receive donations in the future, just as much as you don't, discontinue services to people who are tax evaders, ladies and gentlemen, members of today's debate. The only response that he said, well, they've done it before, but we don't think so. It's not true. It's not as extensive as the AIDS campaign. It's not extensive as the breast awareness campaign because we don't even know one single commercial which had a public donation. They said, well, we have commercials. What is that commercial to begin with, ladies and gentlemen? They've never done it. But even if there is a commercial, is it as extensive as the AIDS problem that we actually have in today's debate? So we say that if awareness is a problem, therefore it's something which can be addressed by intensified awareness of AIDS. Let's move on to the second issue. Where do we protect rights more? But before that, yes.
If your campaigns fail, what then do you do under your model?
Then have more campaigns, but at least you respect people intensifying campaign. If your proposal fails, for example, and people died in your proposal, how could you be able to return the life of these individuals who died to begin with, especially the rights that we were able to give upfronted at the end of the day? So where do we protect, ladies and gentlemen, the rights of these individuals? We've talked about two important rights. First is the right to autonomy, and the second one is the right to life. The first one is autonomy. They said that they also respect informed consent. Because the idea of informed consent is something that's pegged on the autonomy of the individual, wherein the person can decide for himself beyond the influence of anybody else, beyond the influence of the state, because it assumes that the individual is the one who is the arbiter of what's best for himself. Madam Speaker, members of today's debate. We said if you have these kind of threat, it's as if the state is forcing you to make a decision. It's as if the state is telling you what's the right thing that you should do, instead of the individual making that decision itself. What Deputy Prime Minister did is to say that, well, it's the same as manipulating heartstrings. Are you kidding me? There's a very big difference between putting, being at gunpoint, for example, or threatening your life, with showing pictures of Bono, for example, having ad commercials. There's no threatening. If you threaten one person's life, you're left without any choice anymore. That's the reason why there is indeed a vitiation of consent. There's a very big difference. But more than that, vitiation of consent, ladies and gentlemen, because of life. The state is not telling you what to value, Mr. Speaker, because at the point of your death, these decisions do change to begin with. That's something the second speaker talked about, which was never responded to by the previous speaker. Now, in a very last-ditch attempt, they said, well, it's not absolute. For example, we have do not resuscitate decisions. No, it's very different, because people are not forcing you to sign up do not resuscitate orders, right? In this particular situation, you are being forced to sign up to donate, largely because your life is at stake. Now, what is your response to that particular attack to the autonomy of that individual? There's no response coming from that. The second thing is the right to life, because we've comprehensively told you that there is indeed an affront to the life of the individual. Because if you do not sign up, therefore you're not going to receive that particular organ. Ina's response was rather flippant. She said, no, there's a very, very big difference between right to life and equality of life. Are you kidding me? Because if you don't have the particular organ, you'll get a life to begin with. Like, for example, kidney disease or probably heart disease. Your quality of life is not the only thing that's threatened here, but your very existence to begin with, because you can't live in this chair with a dysfunctional organ to begin with. These are values that we think should be protected, and we think that the state should not play with, ladies and gentlemen, members of today's debate. It's not just like a right to job, because right to job is an economic right, which is commutable, but the right to life is something sacred and sacrosanct, Mr. Chair, which the state is immune from actually intervening. Having said all those things, I think it's rather clear we win today's debate. Thank you very much.
Those I thank the opposition leader speaker, and now I'd like to invite opposition leader.
Here.
Madam Speaker, I raised the POI in PM's speech. I asked them, if it's so crucial and important, why didn't the state break the right to keep organs so we can live a little longer, have hearts, have kidneys? And the response coming from them is that it's because of consent. That's when we ask them, what is consent for? What is the right to say no for? Because if Deputy Prime Minister and Whip suddenly said it's just a secondary right, doesn't it mean that it's a violable right, so we can realize the greater value of having more hearts and having lungs? They were so afraid to defend the use of force, which means that the idea of consent is so valuable in today's debate. And if we can prove that you're vitiating consent under their model, they automatically fall. The first question that we need to ask them is the policy going to achieve the end goal And this is where government forced us to defend Roman. They tell us people are dying, there are no hearts, what are you gonna do? And if your information fall according to the whip, what are you gonna do? Obviously, opposition never took on the idea that we will save everyone. Because in anything, like in any medical condition, that's the principle of justice. We can't save everyone. If despite all the information, they still say no, we think that's a choice that individuals took. And this is why we are respecting religion, we are respecting identity. In their side, they never argued why that choice to say no is still higher, ladies and gentlemen. They only said that you telling me that I should not have, me not donating an organ is an automatic disrespect to the state. But they never realized and never analyzed why the state's obligation to help you is eliminated at that point in time. In fact, government bench wasn't able to defend their policy. There was no defense how their policy suddenly works. They just assumed that magically it will change the mindset of people, and people will say, go get my organs, I'm so afraid I'm gonna need a kidney soon. And this is where hyperbolic discounting works against them. Because they both conceded that I am detached from my future self, and that I don't have the idea that I might need a kidney soon, ladies and gentlemen. So if they don't see themselves needing it, how is you telling them that they won't need a kidney in the future suddenly going to make them give it up to the state? The mindset isn't changing. In fact, it's only in opposition that we were able to defend. If you want to change the mindset of an individual, this is where the face of the state that is able to tell them, maybe we disagreed with each other in the past, but at the point of death, the state is still willing to help you. That's more likely going to make them realize that giving up organs so that they can help other people is a possibility as well. And this is where INA also failed in today's debate, because the strength of their policy is the warning that you will not be able to live a quality life or live life at all if you don't undergo their policy. She said, oh, but you can opt to have a dialysis as compared to a kidney transaction. That means then that this disincentive to undergo their policy isn't high enough for people to do it. The debate happens in life and death situations when there are no other alternatives to that, and the person did not sign up. What is the state's obligation? And this is where we were disgusted with opposition of government bench, because they look at rights as purely economic and utilitarian in nature. They tell us because the right to build a road is pegged to the right to get a job. But if I don't have a heart, then I won't be able to exercise my right to life, which is pegged on my ability to get a job so that I can contribute taxes so that the state can build roads. But we already said, coming from opposition bench, that while you're alive, there are instances that that individual has contributed enough for the state to say that your life is worth saving because you contributed in the state back. You can't really qualify at this point in time, so the obligation is even better on our side because you keep the state at check. We talk about the right of an individual, the right to say no exists, but the obligation of the state to help you does not end, even if you disagree with state policies. For all of these reasons, it's rather clear. Sanbera is taking this.
First, how do we address shortage? Second, where are rights upheld? In terms of shortages, we think that this was an area in the debate that was significantly glossed over by the negative bench when we talked to you extensively about how we're going to increase the supply. So we told you that in all likelihood, we significantly increase the supply of organs right now, and that's a good thing, given that all conceded that the problem of organ shortage is very significant. And if you take a look at the very worst case, like assuming our policy does absolutely nothing, what we end with is status quo. We're going to have people who are donating organs right now to still continue donating. We don't really see why there's any downside risk to our policy. But moreover, we told you that we're going to change the incentive structure because there's very little risk, i.e. you don't lose anything because your organs are only taken away when you die, and there's very high return because if you need a new lung, you can get a new lung. What was the response? The only response coming from these guys was to talk about the most extreme situation, about them only consenting when they die, therefore it's useless. Quite frankly, and that came very late coming from Upwip, we don't understand why it's useless, because if and when you do consent at the point at which you die, that's still another heart, 2 more lungs, 2 more kidneys to give out to everybody else when you do die. So that still addresses our problem of scarcity, no matter whether you say that you want to sign up now, or whether you're saying that you want to sign up at your deathbed. So we proved to you, ladies and gentlemen, that we can still increase the supply of organs. Let's apply the same burden to them. The only thing they said is, we can have awareness campaigns. We told you that it's not enough, and we already told you that it's not mutually exclusive. We can have all of their awareness campaigns too, because nothing in the motion bars the prop from saying that we can have awareness campaigns too, right? But the important question is, if these campaigns fail and we don't get enough organs, what do you do? And we all laughed in this room when the answer was, campaign even more, because it was a silly response. The fact that the campaigns have already failed means that you can't just smother people with even more heartfelt information, given that it's already failed. So I think that Reply actually gave up on that burden because he merely said, look, we can't save everybody. That's not what your leader of opposition said when they initially clashed with the problem, saying that they can address it too. That's not what Opwip said when he said that we can also address this shortage. So we think that, quite frankly, they gave up on this issue. That's why we're taking it. Second, in terms of rights, they said that this coercive, consent is important, and at Opwip they raised this very one-line analysis of their at gunpoint. But the first thing you need to ask yourself was, what was really the analysis to suggest that this is going to be coercive? Because they never explained to us, what do these people stand to lose if they actually sign up? What is the harm of being buried with 1 less heart, with 1 less lung? They never really explained to us why it's so important. But secondly, we think that their only analysis of void consent is people are emotional about it. It's hard to make a decision. But Ina already told you, coming from Gulfwip, that having emotions such as feeling scared and sad does not nullify choice, because all choices are a mix of logic and emotion. If you take a look at getting married, if you take a look at signing a do not resuscitate, we think that it's the same thing. But finally, even if we assume that it is coercive, we already told you that their situation is more coercive, because they're creating a world wherein you don't even have the choice whether you want, whether it is possible to sign something and get a heart, because there are no hearts to give, because there is still a shortage under their model. We think that that's vastly damaging. But finally, in terms of reciprocity, what these guys kept on contending, and they misrepped us, because we told you that the right to receive organs is a secondary right. What we told you rather extensively was that it's a secondary right because 1, you can opt out, and number 2, you can be denied. For instance, if you're a drinker or if you're a smoker, you can be denied. That means that the right is not necessarily absolute. They didn't really recover from that. But finally, their final analysis was that you contributed to society anyway. This was undynamic to the analysis coming from DPM, that your contribution doesn't necessarily manifest in creating another organ and addressing the supply. That's why a different contribution is necessary aside from your tax money, because we're dealing with a different benefit and we're dealing with a different right. That was why this particular contribution is important and not any big general contribution in the form of tax money. Because we believe, ladies and gentlemen, these guys didn't really solve the problem they set out to solve at the very beginning, because we think, ladies and gentlemen, it's perfectly fine to allocate rights in this manner. Ateneo A is taking this debate. Thank you.